This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 281 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. It was an unfortunate week in fantasy football. There were lots and lots of injuries. And there were injuries to key quarterbacks like Drew Brees and Ben Roethlisberger. And that has a big domino effect on the rest of the players on those rosters. So now you, like a lot of us, are scrambling. And that feeling sucks. But I assure you, it's going to be okay. Not only because it's just fantasy football, but because we have a process. And we have a way to make our rosters better through that process. That's what this 15 transactions episode is about each week. I'll give you a handful of players to buy, sell, add, and drop, but I'll also give you the reasoning behind it. And then you guys can take that logic and apply it however you want. You may find other gems out there to buy that I don't talk about on this show, because it's not like I'm covering every single player in the league. But just take a deep breath and know that it's going to be okay. Your fantasy rosters are not dead. You're not done. We've still got a lot of football left to play. Before getting to this week's transactions, though, I wanted to let you guys know about OddsFire. Whether you're playing DFS or just betting on sports, OddsFire is a key tool to your research. Shop for the best lines in each market and see which side is getting the most bets and money. OddsFire is the premier odds comparison experience across major bookmakers in the regulated U.S. market. Never settle, always get the best odds. Check out the experience for free now on NumberFire or at oddsfire.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Sell Josh Jacobs. So after week one, it looked like Josh Jacobs was going to be a workhorse for Oakland. But as we know, they were also in a positive game script throughout that entire game. They ran 0 offensive snaps while trailing. Week 2 against Kansas City was obviously different. Oakland ran 43 offensive snaps while trailing. And that turned into just 12 rush attempts for Josh Jacobs, and unfortunately, 0 targets. Now, this is kind of surprising because Josh Jacobs came out of school as a good pass catcher. He really should be on the field in negative game scripts, but the Raiders opted to use DeAndre Washington and Jalen Richard instead. They combined for 5 targets against Kansas City. And now, according to Pro Football Focus, Jacobs has run just 21 routes this season. Not only is that outside the top 40 at running back, but that's the same number as Jalen Richard. So what does this mean? It means that Josh Jacobs is a better bet in positive game scripts, but we know that Oakland isn't very good. They're going to face a lot of negative game scripts this year. And if they're not going to deploy Josh Jacobs as a pass-catching running back, that's not good news. That's not good news for Jacobs at all. And upcoming for the Raiders are matchups against the Vikings, Colts, Bears, Packers, and Texans. That doesn't exactly scream positive game script. So right now, I think is the time to sell Josh Jacobs. Buy Christian Kirk. I talked about Christian Kirk on last week's 10 Trends show and how he was going to be a buy candidate in this week's 15 Transactions episode. I just didn't expect Christian Kirk to have 114 yards against that Baltimore secondary. But even still, I think that he's a buy. You know, in fantasy football and really anything, the whole idea is to really buy low and sell high. That's what I talk about each week on this show. But sometimes you have to buy a little bit higher than you would like to buy. And I think that's the case with Christian Kirk. Through 2 games, Kirk has a 22.5% target share in this Cardinals offense. That's a top 30 rate at wide receiver right now. And the difference between what Christian Kirk gets from a target share perspective and what someone in like San Francisco gets is that the pie in Arizona is a lot larger. No team through 2 weeks has more pass attempts than Arizona has. And if you remove that overtime period against Detroit, they still rank 7th. And it's all because of their pace. So far, Arizona leads the league in seconds per play by over 2 seconds. That means the target share for any of these pass catchers in this offense is coming from a larger pie. There's more volume to go around. And the fact that he has a top 30 target share right now is really good for what's to come. I think that you can buy Christian Kirk right now, and I'm fine if you want to buy any other pieces in this Arizona Cardinals offense. That includes Larry Fitzgerald. Add DeMarcus Robinson. So I talked about Mecole Hardman last week on this show because of Tyreek Hill's injury. He went out and he had 4 catches for 61 yards and a touchdown. And that line actually could have been better if LaShawn McCoy wasn't called for a holding penalty on a 72-yard touchdown to Hardman. But the thing is, Hardman played the 3rd most snaps at wide receiver on Sunday. It was Sammy Watkins, and then it was DeMarcus Robinson, and then Mecole Hardman. Robinson had the same number of targets as Hardman on Sunday, but he was able to do a lot more with them, finishing the game with 172 receiving yards and a pair of touchdowns. So if he's the number 2 wide receiver in this offense from a volume perspective and from a snap share perspective, he needs to be rostered. Drop Dante Moncrief. Now, I've talked about this on the show before, but drops are usually an overrated statistic in football. Because in order to drop the ball, a receiver has to get open and targeted. And if a receiver's open, that means that he ran a good route. And if he's running good routes consistently, then drops aren't that big of a deal. Not only that though, but the difference in drop rate from one receiver to the next is not likely to be very significant. The delta between one player to the next isn't that big of a deal. Unless you're Dante Moncrief. Moncrief now has 5 drops on 11 targets this season. And his big week 2 drop, which resulted in an interception, it also resulted in him being benched. Juju Smith-Schuster, James Washington, and Deontay Johnson all played more snaps than Dante Moncrief in week 2. And now there's no more Ben Roethlisberger, who's out for the year. Moncrief is rostered in about half of Yahoo leagues, which is why I'm talking about him today. So in honor of Dante Moncrief, feel free to drop him. Buy Mike Evans. I talked about Evans last week on this show, and he turned in a 4-catch, 61-yard performance on Thursday Night Football. That's not great. He now doesn't have a touchdown through 2 games, and he's been outplayed and outproduced by his teammate Chris Godwin. But here's the thing. According to airyards.com, Mike Evans has 55 more air yards than Chris Godwin has. And Evans has an 18 average depth of target. That's the 4th highest in the league among all 10-plus target pass catchers. Those are all very positive signs for Mike Evans. And he only has 2 fewer targets than Godwin so far. And don't forget, he was sick in week 1, like physically ill. I won't talk about Evans for the rest of the year. I promise that I'm done, but I do think that he's a good buy right now, and he should be fine for the rest of the season. Add Darwin Thompson. So LaShawn McCoy had an MRI on his ankle on Monday, and Damian Williams left their game against Oakland early with a knee injury. Both of those players could end up missing time. We don't know at the time of this recording. But to me, it's always smart to be aggressive with running back ads off the waiver wire. So getting Darwin Thompson makes a lot of sense. He's next in the pecking order. And to this point, do the same thing with Jalen Samuels if he's out there. Because James Conner also is dealing with a knee injury, though he seems to be fine. Add Deebo Samuel. So I was tilting at the snap distribution for San Francisco in week 2. Because in week 1, Deebo Samuel led the team in snap share with a share above 88%. And as we know, Dante Pettis had 2 snaps. And then on Sunday, things looked a lot different. Marquise Goodwin led the team with a 51.4% snap share, and that was followed by Pettis at 48.6%. Samuel was the most productive 49ers wide receiver on Sunday, but he was 4th on the team at wide receiver in snaps. So really what I'm doing with Deebo Samuel right now is I'm just buying into the player and buying into the talent who looks to be the best at the position on his team. Deebo Samuel's a rookie, so the hope is that his snap share continues to climb as this talent emerges. And it doesn't hurt that he has a 19% target share through 2 games. Sell Sony Michel. So over the offseason, you might remember, but there was a little bit of hype surrounding Sony Michel's potential as a pass catcher in this New England Patriots offense. So far through 2 games, he has 0 targets. Now it's true that New England hasn't had any sort of negative game script through these 2 games. They've dominated. And that type of environment is good for Michel. He's going to see a lot of work on the ground when New England's leading. And that's what we saw on Sunday. But the Patriots, as usual, are still targeting their running backs in the passing game a lot, despite these positive game scripts. We've seen over 32% of their targets go to running backs. That's the 2nd highest mark in the league, and technically they should rank first, but Tariq Cohen is being credited as a running back, even though he played as a slot receiver in week 1. So technically, New England's throwing to their running backs at a higher rate than any other team in football right now. And Sony Michel has 0 targets. So I don't really buy this argument that Michel hasn't been involved as a receiver because of game script. In a negative game script, Sony Michel might not even be on the field. And we also know that New England's arguably the best team in the league, so how often are they going to be in a negative game script? So that means that Sony Michel is back to just being this touchdown-dependent, low-floor option each week. Of course the scoring upside is there. This offense could be amazing this year. So of course he's going to find the end zone. But I just worry about the week-to-week volatility, especially in PPR formats. Add Golden Tate. So you might forget, but Golden Tate's currently serving a 4-game suspension for violating the NFL policy on performance-enhancing substances. But we're approaching week 3 now, so he's close to returning. And the Giants could really use Golden Tate, because Sterling Shepard is currently dealing with a concussion, and they really have no one else at wide receiver. They've had 3 wide receiver instances of 7+ targets so far this season, so Golden Tate's just going to walk into some volume once he's off the suspension. Right now, he's rostered in just 35% of Yahoo leagues, so you should get him this week rather than waiting for when everyone else is going to try to get him. Buy Robert Woods. In week 1, the odd man out among all Rams pass catchers was basically Brandon Cooks. So he was a buy on this show last week. On Sunday, it ended up being Robert Woods. He only had 2 targets. He had 13 in week 1. So it makes sense to buy Bobby Woods right now. He still has a near 23% target share in that LA offense through 2 games. And as I mentioned with Cooks last week, the Rams have a very favorable schedule for their passing attack moving forward. They won't see a tough secondary and defense until their week 11 game against the Bears. And then they face the Bears and then the Ravens in back-to-back weeks. Until that point, though, things are looking good for Jared Goff and his wide receivers. So buy Bobby Woods. Hold Kerryon Johnson. So entering the season, for Kerryon Johnson to hit his ceiling this year, 2 things had to happen. First, he needed to see goal line work. Last year, those goal line touches went to LeGarrette Blount and not Kerryon Johnson. Johnson had 2 goal line rushes. The second thing that needed to happen is that he needed to see an uptick in receiving work. We knew that he wasn't likely to be a 250+ carry running back this year, but we also knew that he had the opportunity to see a lot of work in the passing game. So far, neither of those things have really happened. Now, at the surface level, what's most concerning about Johnson is his usage as a receiver. He did have a nice receiving touchdown in week 2. He looks great as a receiver, but he has a 7% target share. That currently ranks outside the top 30 at the running back position. Now, on top of that, he's now carried just 53.9% of the Lions' running back rushes. That's outside the top 20 in the league. He did miss a big chunk of Sunday's fourth quarter with an injury, but the Lions only ran 10 plays without Johnson. On those plays, CJ Anderson had 4 rushes. One of those plays was also a quarterback kneel. Even if you remove those CJ Anderson runs from the equation, Johnson still has a running back rushing share outside the top 20. The big question mark is the goal line work. That's still up in the air, because Detroit hasn't run a single play from within their opponent's 5-yard line this season. We don't know how that backfield distribution is going to look when they're about to score. So overall, it makes sense if you want to sell Johnson given this usage. If it continues, he's likely to not live up to his draft day cost. But I think it's more advantageous to hold right now. Not only is he the best running back in that backfield objectively, but our sample sizes are small enough to where target shares can be volatile. It's not like they're not using him in the passing game like we're seeing with Sony Michel. This is a different kind of situation. A couple of more targets could drastically change the target share equation. And if Johnson does indeed get the team's goal line work, then he should be just fine. Add Frank Gore. So we're another year older, and Frank Gore is still an ad off the waiver wire. This happens every single season in one way or another. But really, he's an ad this week because Devin Singletary is dealing with a hamstring injury. I don't know the severity of that injury, but again, you're just going to add a running back who could have the chance to walk into some volume. And that's the case for Frank Gore. And not only that, but Gore's already handled over 73% of the Bills' running back rush attempts this season. He's already sort of been the primary early down back for that team. So I would get Gore this week because maybe Singletary misses some time. Buy Leonard Fournette. You guys probably know this, but generally speaking, I don't like getting running backs who are in bad offenses. It's not the best idea strategically. But right now, where we're at in fantasy football is there are so few running backs who are true bell cows. And Leonard Fournette is that. Only Christian McCaffrey has seen a higher percentage of his team's running back carries so far this season than Leonard Fournette has. And meanwhile, Fournette's 6th at running back in target share. Now, he hasn't been all that productive with 113 yards on 28 carries, but he also hasn't found the end zone yet. And that's helpful for him being a buy low candidate. So I think that Fournette's going to provide a nice floor week in and week out. And if Gardner Minshew develops as a passer, then all of a sudden Fournette has a higher ceiling than we expected too. Add Jimmy Garoppolo. So depending on your league, Garoppolo might be available, and if he is, he makes for a pretty good streaming choice this week. He gets Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh's secondary has been pretty bad through the first 2 weeks of the season. They've allowed an 8.3 net yards per attempt, which is a top 5 number in the league. Now, I understand they face Tom Brady and Russell Wilson, but the secondary is a weakness in that Pittsburgh defense. Jimmy G looked a lot better in week 2 versus week 1. He's at home. They're big favorites. It's a good spot for him. Add the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense. I can't believe that I'm talking about the Buccaneers defense as a streaming option, but Todd Bowles has done a really good job so far through these 2 games as their new defensive coordinator. They rank in the top 5 in yards per play against. Now, they haven't really been able to get to the quarterback, but they get Eli Manning and the Giants this week, and they're at home and they're 6.5 point favorites. That's exactly what you look for in a streaming defense choice. The 16th transaction that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com this week is to add Devin Smith. Michael Gallup is going to be sidelined for at least a couple of weeks, and that brings an opportunity for another Cowboys pass catcher to produce since this Cowboys offense has opened things up this year. And that person could be Devin Smith. Randall Cobb has primarily played in the slot this year, which is not a surprise, but he has an 87% snap rate from the slot. So Smith becomes the outside replacement for Michael Gallup. Smith had a great preseason, and in week 2, he caught 3 of 3 targets for 74 yards and a touchdown. So if you're in a deeper format, Smith is an interesting add this week, especially in a cake matchup against the Dolphins. And don't tell me that Smith isn't available in your league. He's got a 0% ownership percentage in Yahoo leagues right now. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. As always, if you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. I try to answer fantasy questions on there whenever I get the time. Appreciate you guys. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends episode.